The rattling of the stage coach wheels against the dusty trail matched the rhythm of Josephine Adams' racing heart as she gripped her letter of promise in trembling fingers. Montana Territory, 1883, a place she'd never been, to marry a man she'd never met, who sat behind iron bars in the territorial prison. She'd been desperate enough to answer an advertisement, but not desperate enough to ignore the sinking feeling in her stomach that she'd made a terrible mistake. The coach lurched over a rut, sending dust through the open window and onto the folds of her gray traveling dress. Josephine brushed it away, squinting toward the horizon where the outline of Buffalo, Montana, finally appeared. A small frontier town set against the backdrop of mountains still capped with patches of spring snow. "First time in Buffalo, miss?" the elderly woman across from her asked, peering over wire-rimmed spectacles. "Yes," Josephine replied, folding the letter and tucking it into her reticule. "I'm to be married." The woman's eyebrows lifted. "Lucky man, young pretty thing like yourself." Josephine forced a smile, deciding against mentioning that her betrothed was serving 5 years for cattle rustling. Not that she had many options back in Boston, not after her father's death left her with debts and no means to pay them. 23 and unwed, she'd faced a life of servitude or worse. When she'd seen the advertisement, it had seemed like providence. "You're Edward Morgan's mail-order bride, ain't you?" the stage-coach driver called back through the window, his weathered face appearing briefly. "Heard tell you were arriving today. Whole town's talking." Heat crept up her neck. "Yes, that's me," the driver chuckled. "Well, you sure are braver than most, miss, taking on a convict for a husband." The coach rolled into Buffalo's Main Street, a stretch of wooden buildings lining both sides of a wide, dusty road. Men in dusters and wide-brimmed hats moved along boardwalks while horses stood hitched to posts. Nothing like Boston, with its cobblestone streets and brick buildings. The stage pulled to a stop outside the Buffalo Hotel. Josephine gathered her valise and carpet bag, wondering who would greet her. Edward's letter had mentioned his friend would meet her, arrange for her to visit him at the prison and help with wedding preparations. "Miss Adams." A tall man approached as she descended from the coach. His face was partially shadowed by his hat, but she could see he was younger than she'd expected, perhaps 30. "I'm Frank Garrison." Josephine straightened her spine, trying to hide her fatigue from the 3-day journey. "Mr. Garrison, you're Edward's friend." He removed his hat, revealing sandy hair and eyes the color of a summer sky. Deep lines around those eyes suggested he smiled often, though he wasn't smiling now. "Not exactly," he said, his voice low. "I'm the ranch foreman. Edward worked for me before." He trailed off. "Before he was arrested," Josephine finished for him. "You don't need to tiptoe around it, Mr. Garrison. I'm aware of my future husband's situation." Frank looked at her directly then, his gaze assessing. "Are you? Because I'm not sure you know what you're getting into, Miss Adams." He glanced around the busy street. "Let's get you settled at the hotel. We can talk more privately there." Josephine hesitated. Edward's letter hadn't mentioned a hotel. She'd assumed she would stay with his friend until the wedding. But Frank Garrison was already lifting her bags and the stagecoach was pulling away. "I don't understand," she said, following him toward the hotel's entrance. "I was led to believe the wedding would happen quickly." Frank paused at the door. "Miss Adams, there's been a development." "But this isn't the place." His voice was gentle but firm, brooking no argument. The hotel lobby was modest but clean, with a polished wooden counter and a small sitting area. Frank spoke quietly to the clerk, who handed him a key. He led her up a narrow staircase to the second floor, unlocked a door, and set her bags inside a small but tidy room. "I'll wait in the parlor downstairs while you freshen up," he said. "Take your time." 20 minutes later, Josephine descended the stairs, having washed the travel dust from her face and changed into a fresh blue dress. She found Frank waiting in a corner of the parlor, away from other guests. "Please sit, Miss Adams," he said, standing as she approached. She perched on the edge of the chair opposite him. "What's this development you mentioned, Mr. Garrison?" Frank leaned forward, his elbows on his knees. "Edward Morgan was involved in more than cattle rustling, Miss Adams. Last week, he attempted to escape. In the process, he killed a guard." Her breath caught. "I don't understand." "He's been sentenced to hang in 3 weeks' time." The room seemed to tilt around her. That can't be. His letters, we've been corresponding for months. He said he'd be released in 4 years. I'm sorry, truly I am. Frank's voice was heavy with sincerity. But that's not all, Edward. He's not who you think he is. What do you mean? He never worked on my ranch. I know him because I was the one who tracked him down and brought him in. Frank removed his hat, revealing a silver star pinned to his vest. I'm the deputy sheriff here in Buffalo County. Josephine stared at the badge, her mind reeling. You're a lawman, he nodded. Edward Morgan is an alias. His real name is Thomas Blackfield. He's wanted in 3 territories for theft, fraud, and now murder. But the marriage contract was another of his schemes. He's done this before, Miss Adams. Promises marriage to women with some means, then disappears with their money. He paused. Did you send him anything? Money, valuables? She shook her head, though in truth she had nothing to send. The journey west had consumed her last dollars. Just letters. Relief flickered across his face. That's good. But it doesn't change the fact that you've traveled across the country for nothing, and I'm sorry about that. Josephine's eyes burned with unshed tears, but she refused to let them fall. What am I to do now? I have nowhere to go, no money to return east. Frank's expression softened. You're free to choose better, Miss Adams. Buffalo's growing. We need teachers, seamstresses. There's honest work here for a woman willing to make a fresh start. Why would you help me? She asked suspiciously. You don't know me. Because I've seen too many women hurt by men like Blackfield. He stood, placing his hat back on his head. Rest tonight. Tomorrow I'll introduce you to some folks who might offer work. And what of my intended marriage? Frank's gaze was steady. There won't be any marriage, Miss Adams. Even if you wish to proceed, which I strongly advise against, Blackfield is set to hang before month's end. He cannot marry anyone. The finality of his words struck her like a physical blow. Everything she had planned, however desperate those plans might have been, had vanished in an instant. Thank you for your honesty, Deputy Garrison, she said stiffly. He nodded, then hesitated. Miss Adams, I know this is a shock, but Buffalo can be a good place, a place for new beginnings. After he left, Josephine sat alone in the parlor for a long while, staring at nothing. Then she returned to her room, closed the door, and finally allowed the tears to come. Morning brought sunlight streaming through thin curtains and the sounds of a town coming to life. Josephine had slept fitfully, her dreams haunted by faceless men behind prison bars and long, lonely roads leading nowhere. A knock at her door roused her from her troubled reverie. She opened it to find a young maid with a tray. Deputy Garrison asked me to bring you breakfast, miss, the girl said, setting the tray on a small table. He said to tell you he'll come by at 10 o'clock if that suits. Yes, thank you, Josephine replied, eyeing the plate of eggs and toast. Her stomach growled, reminding her she hadn't eaten since yesterday's noon meal. After washing and dressing in her second-best dress, a green calico with minimal trim, she ate the now cold breakfast and began taking stock of her situation. She had 3 dresses, undergarments, a few personal items, and exactly $4.17 to her name. Not enough for a ticket back east, and certainly not enough to establish herself here. Deputy Garrison arrived precisely at 10, knocking politely. When she opened the door, she found him dressed much as he had been the day before, though he'd traded his dusty duster for a clean jacket. Good morning, Miss Adams. Did you rest well? As well as could be expected, she answered truthfully. He nodded, understanding in his eyes. I've made arrangements for you to meet with Mrs. Hoffman at the dress shop. She mentioned needing help, and I thought, given your fine stitching. He gestured to her dress. Josephine glanced down, surprised. You noticed my sewing? A slight flush colored his tan cheeks. The detail work on your collar. My mother was a seamstress. She touched the small embroidered flowers she'd added to the collar. I see, well, thank you. They walked down Buffalo's Main Street, Frank pointing out landmarks as they went: the general store, the sheriff's office, the small schoolhouse at the end of the road. Buffalo was larger than she'd first thought, with perhaps 500 souls. The town's growing, Frank explained. The railroad came through last year. We're expecting the population to double within 2 years. And yet you have no proper dressmaker. Mrs. Hoffman does her best, but she's getting on in years. Most women here make their own clothes or order from catalogs. But with more people coming, especially the wives of railroad men and bank clerks, there's demand for finer things. They stopped outside a narrow storefront with a window display of ribbons and fabrics. A bell tinkled as they entered, announcing their presence to the white-haired woman bent over a cutting table. "Martha," Frank called, "I've brought Miss Adams to see you." The elderly woman looked up, adjusting her spectacles. "So this is the young lady you mentioned. Come closer, dear." "Let me see you." Josephine stepped forward, conscious of both Frank's and Mrs. Hoffman's scrutiny. The older woman made a circuit around her, nodding approvingly. "Good posture, elegant hands. You say you have experience with fine sewing?" "I do," Josephine confirmed. "I worked as a seamstress's assistant in Boston for 3 years, and I've been making my own clothes since I was 12. Mrs. Hoffman nodded. "Can you draft patterns?" "Yes, madam, and I'm familiar with the latest fashions." "Good, good." Mrs. Hoffman glanced at Frank. "You were right about her, deputy." She turned back to Josephine. "I can offer you room and board plus $2 a week to start. If your work is as good as the deputy claims, we can discuss a better arrangement." It wasn't much, but it was something. "Thank you, Mrs. Hoffman, I accept." "Excellent. There's a room upstairs you can use. Deputy Garrison can fetch your things from the hotel." Frank nodded. "I'll do that now if you'd like, Miss Adams." "That would be kind, thank you," Josephine replied, handing him her room key, Mrs. Hoffman watched him leave, then turned back to Josephine with sharp eyes. "Now, dear, let's be frank. The deputy told me about your situation, about the man in prison." Josephine stiffened. "I see. No need to be embarrassed. Many women come west under similar circumstances, though usually their intended aren't behind bars." The older woman patted her hand. "Buffalo is a place for new beginnings. No one need know your business. That's generous of you." "Not generosity, practicality. I need help and you need work." "But I will say this," Mrs. Hoffman lowered her voice. "You could do worse than catch the eye of Deputy Garrison. He's a good man, lost his wife and baby 5 years back, hasn't looked at a woman since until now." Josephine's cheeks warmed. "Mrs. Hoffman, the deputy is merely being kind." The older woman smiled knowingly. "If you say so, dear. Now let me show you around the shop." By the time Frank returned with her belongings, Josephine had been thoroughly instructed in the shop's organization and Mrs. Hoffman's expectations. They would open officially at 1 o'clock, giving Josephine time to settle into her new quarters. "Everything is arranged then?" Frank asked, setting her bags down in the small but clean room above the shop. "Yes, thanks to you." Josephine hesitated. "Deputy Garrison, I don't know how to thank you properly." "No need for thanks." He shifted his weight, suddenly looking uncomfortable. "Miss Adams, there's something else. Blackfield Edward has asked to see you." Her stomach dropped. "What? You don't have to go," he added quickly. "In fact, I'd advise against it, but he's been insistent since hearing you arrived. I thought you should know." Josephine turned away, moving to the small window that overlooked the busy street below. "What could he possibly have to say to me? I don't know. But if you decided to see him, I would accompany you. You wouldn't be alone with him." She wrapped her arms around herself, feeling cold despite the warm spring day. "I'll think about it." Frank moved to the door. "Take your time, there's no rush." He paused. "Miss Adams," she turned to face him. "Yes. For what it's worth, I'm sorry things turned out this way for you, but I'm glad you're staying in Buffalo." After he left, Josephine sat on the edge of the narrow bed, fingering the letter she'd kept in her reticule. Edward's no, Thomas Blackfield's letter, full of promises and sweet words. All lies. She tore it into pieces and let them fall to the floor. The dress shop proved busier than Josephine had anticipated. Word had quickly spread through Buffalo that Mrs. Hoffman had secured an assistant trained in Boston fashions, and by closing time at 6 o'clock, they had taken orders for 3 new dresses and had appointments for fittings throughout the next week. "You've been a godsend," Mrs. Hoffman declared as they tidied the shop. "I haven't seen this much interest in my humble establishment in years." Josephine smiled, pleased despite her exhaustion. "The ladies here are hungry for fashion, it seems." "And gossip," Mrs. Hoffman added. "Half of them came to get a look at you." The mysterious Easterner who caught Deputy Garrison's attention. Mrs. Hoffman, really? The older woman chuckled. "Don't mind me, dear. I'm just pleased to see Frank taking an interest in someone. He's been alone too long." Josephine changed the subject, asking about dinner arrangements, and soon they were seated at Mrs. Hoffman's small kitchen table sharing a simple meal of stew and biscuits. "Tell me about Boston," Mrs. Hoffman urged. "I've never been further east than St. Louis." So Josephine spoke of cobblestone streets and gas lamps, of the harbor where ships arrived daily from Europe and beyond. She described the public gardens and the stately homes of Beacon Hill, carefully avoiding mention of her own circumstances there. She didn't speak of her father's gambling debts or the creditors who had forced her from their modest home after his death. Later, alone in her room, Josephine sat at the small desk and began a list of the supplies she would need for the upcoming projects. As she worked, her mind returned to Frank Garrison's words. Blackfield wanted to see her. Why? What could he possibly gain? She had no money, no influence. Perhaps he simply wanted to see the woman he had nearly deceived. Sleep eluded her that night. By morning, she had made her decision. Frank was at his desk in the sheriff's office when she entered the following afternoon during her break from the shop. He looked up in surprise. Miss Adams, Deputy Garrison. She clasped her hands tightly before her. I've decided I will see him. Blackfield. Frank stood. Are you certain? Yes, I need to face him, to understand. He studied her for a long moment, then nodded. The prison's a day's ride from here. We'd need to leave early tomorrow, stay overnight in Deer Lodge, and return the following day. Is Mrs. Hoffman willing to spare you? She's given me permission. We have no appointments until Friday. Then I'll arrange it. He hesitated. Miss Adams, are you sure this is what you want? No, she answered honestly, but it's what I need. They left Buffalo before dawn the next day, traveling by horseback rather than stagecoach. Frank had offered her a side saddle from the livery, but Josephine had surprised him by revealing she knew how to ride astride, having learned as a child on her grandfather's farm. You continue to surprise me, Miss Adams, he'd said as they set out on the trail heading northwest. Please call me Josephine. If we're to spend 2 days traveling together, formality seems excessive. He'd smiled then, the first genuine smile she'd seen from him. Josephine, and you must call me Frank. They rode mostly in silence that morning, the spring sun warming the air as they followed the trail through stands of pine and across rolling grasslands dotted with wildflowers. Occasionally, Frank would point out landmarks or name a distant mountain peak. During their midday rest, they shared a simple meal of bread, cheese, and dried apples. May I ask you something personal? Josephine ventured as they sat beneath the shade of a cottonwood tree. Frank looked up from where he was checking his horse's shoe. You may ask, I might not answer, Mrs. Hoffman mentioned you were married once. His hand stilled. I'm sorry, she said you lost them. Frank straightened, his face composed but his eyes revealing pain. My wife Elizabeth and our son died in childbirth 5 years ago. That's terrible, I shouldn't have pried. It's all right, he took a deep breath. What about you? Was there someone in Boston? She shook her head. No, after my father died, I had to work. There was little time for courting, even if I'd had the inclination. And you came west to marry a stranger instead. I came west because I had no choice, she admitted. The man who owned the building where I worked and lived decided I could pay my rent in ways other than money. I left that night with what I could carry. Frank's jaw tightened. I see. I answered Edwards Blackfield's advertisement because it promised security. A home. I thought even marriage to a convict who would eventually be free was better than. She trailed off. Then what awaited you in Boston? He finished for her. They continued riding after their brief rest, the conversation turning to lighter topics: Frank's youth in Illinois, Josephine's favorite books, the changes they'd both witnessed as the country expanded westward. By late afternoon, they reached Deer Lodge, a town slightly larger than Buffalo, dominated by the imposing stone walls of the Montana Territorial Prison on its outskirts. Frank secured rooms for them at the Deer Lodge Hotel, directly across from each other at the end of a quiet hallway. We'll visit the prison at 9 tomorrow, he explained as they parted for the night. Try to rest, Josephine. It won't be easy seeing him. She nodded, suddenly apprehensive about what morning would bring. Thank you, Frank, for everything. He touched the brim of his hat. Good night. The prison loomed gray and forbidding against the morning sky as their rented buggy approached. Josephine sat rigid beside Frank, her hands clutched tightly in her lap. She wore her best dress, a navy blue with white collar and cuffs, her hair neatly pinned beneath a modest hat. We don't have to do this, Frank reminded her softly. Yes, we do. She took a deep breath. I need to see his face when he lies to me. The prison warden, a grim-faced man with a bushy mustache, greeted Frank with a nod of recognition before eyeing Josephine skeptically. "This is the woman Blackfield's been asking for, the one he says is his betrothed." "Yes," Frank confirmed. "Miss Adams traveled from Boston believing she was to marry Edward Morgan. She only learned the truth upon arrival." The warden shook his head. "Blackfield's a sly one. Been causing trouble since he arrived. This is just his latest game. Nevertheless, Miss Adams wishes to see him." "Her funeral," the warden muttered, then winced at his poor choice of words. "Follow me." They were led through heavy iron gates and down cold stone corridors that echoed with the sounds of men in confinement, muttered conversations, occasional shouts, the clang of metal against metal. Josephine fought the urge to reach for Frank's arm, determined to show no weakness. The visiting room was small, with a heavy wooden table bolted to the floor and 3 chairs. A barred window high on one wall provided the only natural light. "Wait here," the warden instructed. "The prisoner will be brought in momentarily." When they were alone, Frank turned to Josephine. "I'll be right beside you. If at any point you wish to leave, just say so." She nodded, unable to find her voice as the door opened and 2 guards entered, escorting a shackled man between them. Thomas Blackfield was taller than she'd imagined, with dark hair and a beard that hadn't been in the photograph he'd sent her. His eyes were sharp and calculating as they immediately found hers, a smile spreading across his face. "My darling Josephine," he said, his voice smooth despite his circumstances. "At last we meet." The guard seated him at the table, securing his shackles to a ring in the floor. 10 minutes, one said to Frank before they both withdrew to stand outside the door. Josephine stared at the man she had agreed to marry, searching his face for any resemblance to the photograph that had accompanied his letters. There was little similarity. That man had been clean-shaven with lighter hair. "You're not Edward Morgan," she said flatly. He shrugged. "Names are such transient things, my dear. The man in those letters, the man who promised to cherish you, to give you a home and family, he was real enough." "He was a fiction," she replied coldly. "A lie you created to lure unsuspecting women." Blackfield's gaze flickered to Frank, then back to her. "I see the good deputy has poisoned you against me. He told me the truth, that you're a thief and a murderer, that you've done this before. And you believe him over me, your intended husband." "You were never going to be my husband," Josephine said, finding strength in her anger. "Even before you killed that guard, you were planning something else. What was it? To escape and disappear with whatever money or valuables I brought." Blackfield's smile never faltered, but something cold entered his eyes. "You're very direct for a lady." "Answer her question, Blackfield," Frank said, speaking for the first time since the prisoner entered. Blackfield leaned back as much as his shackles would allow. "Very well. Yes, Josephine, I had plans. A friend was to help me escape before you arrived. Things went awry. And if they hadn't? What would have happened to me?" He shrugged again. "You would have waited in Buffalo for a husband who never arrived. Eventually, you would have found other arrangements. Like the other women, the ones before me." Her voice shook with barely controlled fury. "Did they find other arrangements after you robbed them?" Something flashed across Blackfield's face, annoyance, perhaps, at being confronted with his crimes. "What do you want from me, Josephine? Remorse? I'm a hanging man. In 3 weeks I'll be dead. Does it matter what I've done?" "It matters to the women you've hurt," Frank interjected. "It matters to Miss Adams, who traveled thousands of miles on false promises." Blackfield's gaze slid to Frank, something calculating in his expression. "Ah, I see how it is. You've set your sights on my bride, deputy. Well, she's quite a prize, isn't she? Those fine Boston manners, that pretty face." Frank's jaw tightened, but before he could respond, Josephine stood. "I've heard enough," she declared. "I came here for answers, and I've received them. Goodbye, Mr. Blackfield. I will not be returning." Blackfield's facade finally cracked. "Wait," he said, an edge of desperation entering his voice. "Josephine, wait. I did mean what I wrote, about wanting a fresh start, a real life." He glanced at the guards outside the door, then lowered his voice. "I have money hidden. It could be yours, a wedding gift." Josephine paused at the door, turning to face him one last time. "There will be no wedding, Mr. Blackfield. You made sure of that when you chose to be the man you are." She walked out without looking back, her steps quickening as she moved down the corridor. Frank caught up to her just as she reached the prison entrance, his hand gentle on her elbow. "Are you all right?" she nodded, not trusting herself to speak until they were outside in the fresh air, away from the oppressive stone walls. "He would have abandoned me," she finally said as they walked toward their waiting buggy, "or worse." "Yes," Frank agreed quietly, "he would have, and I would have let him." She stopped, turning to face Frank. "I was so desperate to escape my situation that I nearly put myself in a worse one." Frank's eyes were full of understanding. "You did what you thought necessary to survive. There's no shame in that." "But there is," she insisted. "I should have been stronger, smarter." "Josephine," Frank said gently, "everyone makes choices they regret. The measure of a person is what they do afterward." He gestured to the prison behind them. "You faced him. That took courage." She took a deep breath, feeling as though a weight had lifted. "Thank you, Frank, for bringing me here, for everything." His smile reached his eyes this time, crinkling the corners. "You're welcome." The journey back to Buffalo was easier somehow, as if confronting Blackfield had freed Josephine from invisible chains. They traveled at a more leisurely pace, stopping to admire views and even detouring to a small creek where they ate lunch with their feet dangling in the cool water. "Tell me about your ranch," Josephine requested as they rested. "Mrs. Hoffman mentioned you still run it, despite your duties as deputy," Frank nodded. "It was Elizabeth's father's place originally. When he died, it passed to us, after I lost her." He paused. "I couldn't bear to live there alone, so I moved to town, took the deputy position. I have a foreman who manages things, but I ride out every few days." "Do you miss it? Living there?" He considered the question. "Sometimes the quiet, the open spaces, seeing the stars without town lights." He smiled ruefully. "But an empty house can be the loneliest place in the world." Josephine understood that feeling all too well. After her father died, their small Boston apartment had felt vast and hollow. "What will you do now?" Frank asked as they prepared to continue their journey. "Will you stay in Buffalo?" "I believe I will," she replied, surprised to realize she meant it. "Mrs. Hoffman needs me and I enjoy the work, and Buffalo seems promising." Something flickered in Frank's eyes, hope, perhaps. "I'm glad to hear it." They arrived back in Buffalo just as the sun was setting, painting the town's simple buildings in gold and amber light. Frank escorted her to Mrs. Hoffman's shop, carrying her small travel bag. "Thank you again," Josephine said as they stood at the shop's back entrance. "For everything." Frank removed his hat, holding it before him. "Josephine, would you allow me to call on you properly, now that this business with Blackfield is settled?" Her heart fluttered unexpectedly. "I would like that very much." His smile was like sunrise after a long night. "Good, that's good." He cleared his throat. "Sunday afternoon, perhaps, we could walk by the creek." Sunday would be perfect. As promised, Frank arrived at precisely 2 o'clock on Sunday, dressed in clean clothes with his hair neatly combed. Mrs. Hoffman made no attempt to hide her approval as she shooed them out the door with instructions not to hurry back. Spring was in full bloom as they walked toward the creek that ran along the eastern edge of town. Wildflowers dotted the grassy banks, and the air was sweet with the scent of pine and new growth. "Buffalo suits you," Frank observed as they found a spot to sit beneath a large cottonwood tree. "You look happier than when you arrived." Josephine smoothed her skirts, a simple blue calico she'd made herself during the evenings. "I am happier. I've found purpose here and friends." "Is that what we are, friends?" Frank's voice was carefully neutral, but his eyes told a different story. "For now," she replied softly. "Though I hope we might become more." His smile was worth every hardship she had endured to reach this place. "I hope so, too." In the weeks that followed, Buffalo truly became home for Josephine. Mrs. Hoffman's dress shop thrived under her influence, drawing customers from as far as Helena, who had heard about the Boston seamstress bringing Eastern fashions to the Montana territory. Frank called on her regularly Sunday walks, Wednesday dinners at the hotel, Saturday evening concerts when traveling musicians passed through town. On the day Thomas Blackfield was scheduled to hang, Frank arrived at the shop looking solemn. "It's done," he said simply when they were alone in the back workroom. "I thought you should know." Josephine nodded, feeling a complex mixture of emotions: relief that the man who had deceived her was no longer a threat, sadness for a life wasted, and a strange sense of closure. "Thank you for telling me," she said, reaching for his hand. He squeezed her fingers gently. "I have something to ask you, Josephine, something I've been considering for some time." Her heart quickened. Yes, the school teacher, Miss Porter, is leaving at the end of the term. She's marrying a rancher from Wyoming. He paused. The school board is looking for a replacement, someone educated with proper manners to instruct the children. I thought, perhaps you might consider it. It wasn't what she had expected him to ask, but the idea took root immediately. Teaching. Me, you mentioned once that you'd attended school until you were 16. That's more education than most here have received, and you have a way with people explaining things clearly. But what about Mrs. Hoffman, the shop? She suggested it, actually. Said you could still help with the finer dressmaking in your spare time, but that the town needs a teacher more than it needs another seamstress. Josephine considered the possibility. Teaching had been a dream once, before her father's death forced her to seek immediate employment. I would need proper books, materials. The school board would provide them, and the position comes with living quarters, a small house behind the schoolhouse. Frank hesitated. It would be yours alone, a place of your own, independence, something she had never truly had. I would like to meet with the school board, she decided, to discuss their expectations. Frank's smile was radiant. I'll arrange it for tomorrow. 3 weeks later, Josephine stood in the doorway of her new home, a tidy 2-room structure with a small porch overlooking a garden plot. Inside was simple but comfortable furniture, a cast iron stove, and bookshelves filled with texts for her upcoming role as Buffalo's school teacher. What do you think? Frank asked, watching her reaction as she explored the space. It's perfect, she breathed, running her fingers along the smooth wooden table that would serve as both desk and dining surface. I can't believe it's mine. There's something else, Frank said, reaching into his pocket and producing a small key. For you, she accepted it, puzzled. What does it unlock? The schoolhouse. You're officially Buffalo's new teacher, Miss Adams. Joy bubbled up inside her. Thank you, Frank, for believing I could do this. I've believed in you since the day you walked into my office and demanded to face a prisoner who had wronged you. His voice grew serious. You're the bravest woman I've ever known, Josephine. She shook her head. Not brave, just stubborn. Both, he corrected with a smile, definitely both. Summer passed in a flurry of preparation. Josephine divided her time between helping Mrs. Hoffman finish outstanding dress orders and readying the schoolhouse for the fall term. Frank was a constant presence, helping repair desks, building new bookshelves, and escorting her on evening walks when the day's work was done. Their courtship progressed slowly, deliberately. Frank was careful never to rush her, always mindful of her initial purpose in coming to Buffalo. But by August, when the evenings grew shorter and the first hints of autumn touched the cottonwood leaves, they both knew their hearts belonged to each other. On a warm Sunday afternoon, Frank took her riding to his ranch for the first time. The Double G spread was larger than she'd imagined, with rolling pastures where cattle grazed and a sturdy 2-story house built of logs and local stone. It's beautiful, Josephine said as they dismounted near the house. Why didn't you bring me here sooner? Frank looked up at the house, something wistful in his expression. I wasn't ready. This place, it holds memories. She understood immediately. Of Elizabeth, he nodded, but it's time. Time to make new memories here. He took her hand, leading her up the steps to the wide porch. I've been thinking, Josephine. The ranch is only 3 miles from town, close enough that someone could teach school and still live here. Her heart skipped. Frank. He turned to face her, still holding her hand. I love you, Josephine Adams. I think I've loved you since that day at the prison when you stood tall and faced down a man who tried to destroy your future. He dropped to one knee, still holding her hand. Will you marry me, make a home with me here? Tears blurred her vision. Yes, she whispered. Yes, Frank. His smile was brilliant as he rose and gathered her into his arms. I promise you'll never regret it, he murmured before his lips found hers. They were married in Buffalo's small church 2 weeks before the school term began. Mrs. Hoffman had insisted on making Josephine's wedding dress a creamy confection of silk and lace that caused gasps when she walked down the aisle. The entire town turned out for the celebration, the schoolchildren she would soon teach presenting her with a handmade quilt for her new home. Are you happy? Frank asked that night as they stood on the porch of their ranch house, gazing up at stars that seemed close enough to touch. Josephine leaned against his solid warmth, marveling at the journey that had brought her here. Completely, she answered truthfully. I came west seeking security, but I found so much more. Frank's arms tightened around her. When you stepped off that stage looking so lost and determined all at once, I wanted to tell you then you're free to choose better. Better than a convict, better than a life of desperation. She turned in his embrace to face him. And I did choose better. I chose you. The school term began with 23 students ranging from 6 to 16 years of age. Josephine found she had a natural aptitude for teaching, firm but kind, demanding excellence while providing the guidance needed to achieve it. The children responded well, even the older boys who had initially tested her resolve with pranks and backtalk. Frank rode her to and from school each day, using the time to tell her about his work as deputy or plans for the ranch. On weekends, they worked side by side, Josephine learning to garden and preserve food for winter, Frank showing surprising skill with needle and thread when buttons needed replacing. "My mother taught me," he explained when she caught him mending his shirt one evening. "Said no man should depend entirely on a woman for such basic skills." She was a wise woman, Josephine observed, thinking how different Frank was from her father, who had expected to be waited on hand and foot. "She would have liked you," Frank said softly, "very much." As winter approached, bringing the first snows and long evenings by the fire, Josephine realized she felt something she had never expected to feel again after her father's death secure. Not just financially, but emotionally. Frank's steady presence, his unwavering support and love, had healed parts of her she hadn't known were broken. Christmas that year was unlike any Josephine had experienced. The ranch house was decorated with pine boughs and red ribbons, the air fragrant with the scents of gingerbread and cinnamon. On Christmas Eve, after attending services in town, they returned home to exchange gifts. Frank presented her with a beautifully bound set of Shakespeare's works. "For the teacher who's bringing culture to our little corner of Montana," he said with a smile. Josephine's gift to him was more personal, a hand-stitched shirt with their initials intertwined over the heart, and news she had been saving for this special night. "Frank," she said after he had admired the shirt, "there's something else." He looked up, curious. "What is it?" She took his hand and placed it gently against her still flat stomach. "We're going to have a baby, in summer." His expression transformed from confusion to wonder to joy in the space of a heartbeat. "A baby, you're certain?" she nodded, tears of happiness filling her eyes. "Doctor Wilson confirmed it yesterday when I went into town for supplies." Frank gathered her into his arms, his own eyes suspiciously bright. "A baby," he repeated in awe. "Our baby." The news spread quickly through Buffalo after the new year, bringing a stream of well-wishers and gifts to the Garrison ranch. Mrs. Hoffman immediately began work on baby clothes, while the mothers of Josephine's students offered advice both practical and superstitious. As her body changed with the growing life inside her, Josephine found herself reflecting often on the strange path that had led her to this happiness. Had she not answered Thomas Blackfield's advertisement, had she not been desperate enough to travel across the country to marry a convict, she would never have met Frank, never have found this life in Buffalo that fulfilled her in ways she hadn't known were possible. "What are you thinking about?" Frank asked one evening in late spring as they sat on the porch watching the sunset, his hand resting protectively over the swell of her belly. "How life surprises us," she answered, covering his hand with her own. "How the worst decisions can sometimes lead to the best outcomes." He nodded thoughtfully. "I've thought the same. If Blackfield hadn't tried to escape, if he hadn't been sentenced to hang, I might never have told you the truth. You might have married him when he was eventually released." The baby kicked then, as if objecting to this alternate history. They both laughed, the moment of what might have been passing like a cloud before the sun. "I would have found my way to you somehow," Josephine said with certainty. "We were meant to be, Frank Garrison." June brought wildflowers and warm breezes, the ranch's pastures lush with new grass for the growing herd. Josephine had reluctantly given up teaching for the final weeks of her pregnancy, turning her classroom over to the minister's wife until the fall term. It was a moonlit night in late June when her labor began, the pains waking her from a sound sleep. Frank, alert to her every movement these last weeks, was instantly awake beside her. "Is it time?" he asked, already reaching for his clothes. She nodded, breathing through the contraction. "I think so." Frank dressed quickly, his movements efficient but his eyes betraying his anxiety. I'll saddle the horse and bring the buggy around. We need to get you to Dr. Wilson." "There's time," she assured him, though the next contraction came sooner than she'd expected. "The baby won't come for hours yet." Nevertheless, Frank insisted on speed, and within 30 minutes they were on the road to town, Josephine bracing herself against the buggy's jolts as her labor intensified. They reached Dr. Wilson's house just as dawn was breaking over the eastern mountains. The doctor, accustomed to middle-of-the-night summons, was quick to usher Josephine into the room he kept prepared for such occasions. "Wait outside, deputy," he instructed Frank. "This is women's work now." Frank looked ready to argue, but a glance at Josephine's reassuring smile convinced him to comply. "I'll be right outside," he promised, squeezing her hand before reluctantly withdrawing. The hours that followed were a blur of pain and effort for Josephine. Dr. Wilson was joined by Mrs. Hoffman, who had been fetched from the dress shop to assist. Their calm voices guided her through each contraction, their experienced hands helping position her for the baby's arrival. "You're doing wonderfully," Mrs. Hoffman encouraged as the morning wore on. "Not long now." Outside, Frank paced the small waiting room, startling at every sound from behind the closed door. When he heard Josephine cry out, he nearly broke his promise to wait, stopped only by the timely arrival of Sheriff Burke. "Sit down before you wear a hole in Wilson's floor," the older man advised, pushing Frank into a chair. "First babies take their time, you might as well conserve your strength." Frank ran a hand through his already disheveled hair. "What if something goes wrong?" "What if—" "Don't borrow trouble," Burke interrupted. "Josephine's strong as they come, and Wilson's delivered more babies than anyone in the territory." Frank nodded, trying to take comfort in the sheriff's words, but he couldn't help remembering Elizabeth, how quickly joy had turned to tragedy. The thought of losing Josephine, a new sound interrupted his dark thoughts, the thin, outraged wail of a newborn. Frank was on his feet instantly, staring at the door as if he could see through it by sheer force of will. Long minutes passed before the door finally opened and Dr. Wilson emerged, wiping his hands on a towel. His tired face broke into a smile at the sight of Frank's anxious expression. "Congratulations, deputy, you have a healthy son." Frank staggered slightly, gripping the back of a chair for support. "A son, and Josephine is doing just fine. Tired, as you'd expect, but she came through like a champion." The doctor clapped him on the shoulder. "You can go in now." The room was warm and dimly lit, Mrs. Hoffman bustling about tidying things while Josephine lay propped up on pillows, a small bundle cradled in her arms. She looked up as Frank entered, her face radiant despite her exhaustion. "Frank," she said softly, "come meet your son." He approached the bed almost reverently, perching carefully on its edge. The bundle in Josephine's arms stirred, and she folded back the blanket to reveal a tiny face with Frank's strong chin and a surprising amount of dark hair. "He's perfect," Frank whispered, reaching out to touch the baby's cheek with a gentle finger. "Would you like to hold him?" Josephine asked. Frank hesitated only briefly before nodding. She carefully transferred the baby into his arms, showing him how to support the small head. Looking down at his son's face, Frank felt a surge of emotion so powerful it nearly overwhelmed him. Love, protectiveness, pride, and a fierce determination that this child would know only happiness and security. "What shall we call him?" Josephine asked. Frank considered. "What about James, after your father?" Tears welled in her eyes. "Really, you wouldn't mind?" "Of course not." "James Garrison has a fine sound to it," she smiled, reaching out to touch both her husband's hand and her son's tiny fingers. "James Franklin Garrison, for both the men who gave him life." That night, with Josephine and baby James settled in the doctor's guest room for observation, Frank rode back to the ranch alone to tend to the livestock. The house felt emptier than it ever had before, but not in the hollow way it had after Elizabeth's death. This emptiness was temporary, filled with promise rather than loss. Standing in the room they had prepared for the baby, with its hand-carved crib and cheerful yellow curtains, Frank allowed himself to fully accept the joy that had entered his life. He had a son. He had Josephine. The past, with all its pain, was finally truly behind him. 2 days later, he brought his family home. Josephine sat in the buggy with James nestled against her chest, her face alight with happiness as they approached the ranch house. Frank had spent the previous evening preparing everything, cleaning, airing out rooms, arranging the flowers Mrs. Hoffman had sent. "Welcome home," he said, helping her down from the buggy with careful hands. Josephine looked up at the house, then at the man beside her, and finally at the child in her arms. "Home," she echoed contentedly. "Yes, it is." Summer passed in a haze of midnight feedings, diaper changes, and moments of wonder as James grew and changed daily. Frank took on more of the ranch work, allowing Josephine to focus on the baby and regain her strength. In the evenings, they would sit on the porch, James sleeping between them, and talk about the future. "Will you return to teaching in the fall?" Frank asked one such evening in late August. Josephine considered the question. "I'd like to if we can manage it, perhaps not full days at first. The older students could help with the younger ones in the afternoon." "Whatever you decide, I'll support," Frank assured her. "The ranch is doing well enough that you needn't work if you don't want to." She smiled, appreciating his consideration but knowing in her heart that she needed more than just motherhood to fulfill her. "I love teaching. And I think it's good for the children of Buffalo to see that women can be both mothers and contributors to the community." Frank nodded, understanding in his eyes. "You're changing this town, you know, in ways that go beyond fashion or education. For the better, I hope." "Definitely for the better." He reached across to take her hand. "Just as you changed my life." Autumn brought cooler days and the start of the school term. True to her word, Josephine returned to teaching, though on a modified schedule that allowed her to be home with James in the afternoons. The arrangement worked well, with Frank often meeting her at the schoolhouse at midday to escort her home. The town continued to grow, the railroad bringing new settlers and opportunities. Buffalo's first bank opened that fall, followed by a proper restaurant and a millinery shop that complemented Mrs. Hoffman's dressmaking establishment. "We'll be a proper city soon," Frank remarked as they walked home from church one Sunday in October. "With all the problems that brings." Josephine adjusted James in her arms, the 6-month-old having fallen asleep during the service. "You sound concerned. Sheriff Burke is talking of retirement next spring. He's asked me to consider taking his place." She stopped walking, turning to look at him. "Sheriff Garrison." "It has a nice sound to it." He smiled at her easy acceptance. "It would mean more responsibility, more time in town, but also more ability to shape Buffalo as it grows." She resumed walking. "I think you should accept if it's what you want. What about the ranch? We'll manage. Johnson is a good foreman, and James will be old enough soon that I can help more." Frank's expression softened as he looked at his sleeping son. "He's growing so fast, sometimes I can hardly believe he's ours." "I know," Josephine agreed. "Every day he seems to learn something new." As if hearing himself discussed, James stirred and opened his eyes, Frank's eyes, blue as a summer sky. He gazed up at his mother, then turned his head to find his father, breaking into a toothless grin that never failed to melt both their hearts. Winter arrived with the first heavy snow in early December, blanketing the ranch in pristine white. James, now crawling and pulling himself up on furniture, watched in fascination from the window as Frank cleared paths to the barn and corral. "He'll be walking before we know it," Josephine observed as she prepared dinner. "And talking too, from the sounds he's been making." Frank stamped snow from his boots by the door. "God help us when he starts asking questions. He's got your curiosity." "And your stubbornness," she countered with a smile. They celebrated Christmas quietly that year, inviting only Mrs. Hoffman and Dr. Wilson to share the holiday meal. James, the center of attention, was showered with gifts, wooden toys from Frank, a hand-sewn teddy bear from Mrs. Hoffman, and his first pair of tiny boots from Dr. Wilson, "for when he's ready to follow in his father's footsteps," the doctor explained with a wink. "Speaking of following footsteps, Mrs. Hoffman said, setting down her coffee cup, "there's talk in town that the school board wants to expand the schoolhouse next summer. Add another room for the older students." Josephine looked up with interest. "Really, they haven't mentioned it to me." "It's just in the planning stages," the older woman explained. "But they'll need a second teacher, someone qualified for the advanced students." Frank exchanged a glance with Josephine. "Something to consider," he said. "Though finding a qualified teacher willing to come to Buffalo might be challenging." The conversation moved on, but the seed had been planted. That night, after their guests had departed and James was asleep in his crib, Josephine broached the subject again. I've been thinking about the school expansion, she said as they sat by the fire. What if we brought someone from back east? Someone like me looking for a fresh start. Frank considered the idea. It could work. We could advertise in Boston papers, perhaps. And offer room and board until they're settled, Josephine added. The little house behind the schoolhouse is still empty. My philanthropic wife, Frank teased gently, always thinking of others. She smiled, leaning against him. I was given a chance at a new life. Why not pass that opportunity to someone else? The new year brought changes to Buffalo and to the Garrison family. In January, Sheriff Burke officially announced his retirement, and Frank was sworn in as his replacement. The ceremony was held in the town square with Josephine proudly watching, James balanced on her hip. Sheriff Garrison, she said later that night, helping him remove the new star pinned to his vest. It suits you. Frank caught her hand, pressing a kiss to her palm. As long as you approve. I more than approve, she assured him. I'm proud of you. Of the man you are, the father you've become, the leader this town needs. His eyes darkened with emotion. I would be none of those things without you, Josephine. You know that, don't you? She shook her head. You were always those things. I just helped you remember. February brought James's first steps, unsteady but determined as he toddled from the sofa to Frank's outstretched arms. March saw his first words Mama and Papa in quick succession, followed by horse and dog, reflecting his growing fascination with the ranch animals. In April, the advertisement Josephine had drafted appeared in 3 Boston newspapers, seeking a qualified teacher for Buffalo's expanding school. By May, responses had begun to arrive, letters from young women and men looking for opportunity in the West, just as she had once done. This one, Josephine said one evening, selecting a letter from the stack. Miss Rebecca Turner, 22, educated at a ladies' seminary in Massachusetts, experienced tutoring children of various ages. Frank read the letter she handed him. She sounds promising. Her reasons for wanting to leave Boston: her parents died last year. She's been living with an aunt who can no longer afford to support her. Josephine's voice softened. She reminds me of myself. Frank looked up, understanding in his eyes. Then Miss Turner it is, if the school board agrees. They did agree, impressed by Rebecca's qualifications and Josephine's endorsement. Arrangements were made for the young woman's journey west, with promises of a position ready for the fall term and temporary lodging provided. Summer brought the planned expansion of the schoolhouse, with Frank organizing volunteers to add the second classroom, while Josephine prepared curriculum for both the younger and older students she would oversee until Rebecca's arrival. James, now a sturdy toddler of 14 months, shadowed his father whenever possible, a miniature version of Frank with his mother's curiosity and determination. He'll be helping build houses before we know it, Frank observed one evening as they watched James stacking wooden blocks with intense concentration. Or teaching, Josephine countered. He loves his books almost as much as he loves your tools. Either way, he'll make us proud. It was late August when the stagecoach arrived carrying Rebecca Turner. Josephine and Frank waited outside the Buffalo Hotel, James perched on his father's shoulders as the young woman descended from the coach. She was smaller than Josephine had expected, with light brown hair and intelligent eyes that took in her surroundings with cautious optimism. Her traveling dress was well made but showed signs of wear, and she clutched a small valise as if it contained all her worldly possessions, which, Josephine realized with a pang, it likely did. Miss Turner, Josephine stepped forward. I'm Josephine Garrison, we've been corresponding. Rebecca's face brightened with recognition. Mrs. Garrison, yes, of course, thank you for meeting me. Her gaze moved to Frank and James. And this must be your family. My husband, Sheriff Frank Garrison, and our son James, Josephine confirmed. Welcome to Buffalo. As they escorted Rebecca to her new lodgings, answering her questions about the town and the school, Josephine found herself transported back in time to her own arrival 4 years earlier. How different her circumstances had been, how uncertain her future had seemed. Later, after settling Rebecca and returning home, she shared these thoughts with Frank as they prepared for bed. I keep thinking how easily that could have been me alone, starting over in a strange place. If you hadn't told me the truth about Blackfield, if you hadn't offered me choices. Frank drew her into his arms. But I did, and you made the choice to stay to build a life here. He kissed her forehead. A wonderful life, if you ask me. She smiled, nestling against his chest. The best life, one I never could have imagined when I stepped off that stagecoach. Do you ever regret it, coming west on false promises? Never, she said firmly, because those false promises led me to true ones, to you, to James, to everything that matters. Outside their window, stars glittered in the vast Montana sky, the same stars Josephine had seen on her first night in Buffalo, when her future had seemed so uncertain. Now, safe in her husband's arms, with their son sleeping peacefully in the next room, she knew with absolute certainty that she had found her place in the world. She had arrived in Buffalo seeking a husband, even one behind bars. Instead, she had found freedom to choose her own path, to love a good man, to build a family and a community that valued her contributions. Frank's voice broke into her thoughts. What are you thinking about? She smiled in the darkness. About choices. About how sometimes the worst circumstances can lead to the best decisions. Like answering an advertisement from a prisoner, like listening to a deputy who said I was free to choose better. His arms tightened around her. I'll spend the rest of my life making sure you never regret that choice. I already know I won't, she whispered, her heart full of certainty. Some choices are forever. You're my forever choice, Frank Garrison. As autumn painted the cottonwoods gold and James's second birthday approached, Josephine often found herself pausing in the midst of her busy days teaching alongside Rebecca, maintaining their home, helping Frank with ranch accounts to marvel at the journey that had brought her to this life. From a desperate young woman willing to marry a convict to the respected teacher and sheriff's wife she'd become, her path had been neither straight nor easy. But standing on the porch of their ranch house, watching Frank swing their laughing son up onto his shoulders, she knew with absolute certainty that she had found her true place in the world. Not as a mail-order bride promised to a man in prison, but as a woman who had been offered the chance to choose better and had done exactly that.